Okay, now let's talk about the security of our VPC endpoints. And they are called the VPC endpoint policies. So VPC endpoint policy, as you can guess, is going to be a JSON document to control access to a service, and this looks just like this, as I've been shown in the one of the sample of the VPC endpoint policies in the example. So in this example, what do we have? Well, we have a policy. We have a policy that allows us to do SQS, send message to a specific queue using a specific principal, which represents a user through IAM. So this is applied to a VPC endpoint. That means that only that user can access this queue through that VPC endpoint, and it has to be an SQS send message action. So this does not override or replace IAM user policies or service specific policies. So you may still have an SQS queue policy, and the IAM user still needs to be allowed to talk to the SQS, but this is yet another level of protection, and this one is happening at the VPC endpoint level. So for the nodes, is that of our IAM user is trying to access SQS out of our VPC endpoint using the public route, then it may still work because the VPC endpoint policy will not apply. And in this case, what we could do is add an SQS queue policy to deny any action that is not done through the VPC endpoint, effectively forcing any connection to go through the VPC endpoint, and then forcing the VPC endpoint policy to be applied no matter what. So another way you can apply your VPC endpoint policy is going to be on an S3 bucket. So here is an example given. In this example, we are restricting access through the VPC endpoint policy to one specific bucket called my_secure_bucket. So here we are saying anyone can do get object and put object on and only on my_secure_bucket. Hopefully that makes sense. But if you can't remember this VPC endpoint policy, VPC endpoint policy is applied to the VPC endpoint level, and one can circumvent it. And if they want to go through the Amazon S3 through the public route, then it will actually restrict the access to that bucket. So here is another VPC endpoint policy, and this time it's only allow access to Amazon Linux 2 repository. So the idea is when our EC2 instances need to do an update of their Linux operating system, what actually goes on is that they are getting some objects on an S3 bucket, and that belongs to Amazon. And so this VPC endpoint policy allows your EC2 instances to have access privately to this repository through a VPC endpoint policy. Okay, so we can combine your VPC endpoint policy and your S3 bucket policy. So your S3 bucket policy may have some specific conditions, and this one example, like AWS source VPCE equals this VPC ID, like VPCE 1A2B 3C 4D given here, to deny any traffic that doesn't come from a specific VPC endpoint. So here we are saying, like, if we have this condition in our S3 bucket policy, then any traffic going through our VPC endpoint is going to be authorized, and any traffic not going through the VPC endpoint is going to be denied. So effectively, we have locked down our S3 bucket to be only usable from our VPC endpoints. And if we have many VPC endpoints and we want to be able to have more global conditions, then we can use the condition AWS source VPE equals for a specific VPC. But here's the case, like the AWS source VPC condition only works for the VPC endpoints and for the private traffic. So this is when you have multiple endpoints and you want to manage access to your S3 bucket for all your endpoints, and you want to manage access to your S3 bucket and all your endpoints. So it only works when you go through the VPC endpoints. So that means that if you want to restrict access using IP, the only way to do it is to use a specific public IP address or an elastic IP. You cannot use the source IP condition to restrict based on the based on the private IP. So remember, if you are having a private VPC endpoint and you want to restrict access using private IP, you have to use AWS source VPC E or source VPC, AWS source VPC as a condition. But if you want to restrict based on the public IP, then you have to use AWS source IP. AWS source IP will apply to the public IPs, and the other ones only apply to the private network traffic. So let's have a look through an example for S3 bucket policy. So the S3 bucket policy restricts your access to your S3 bucket through only one specific VPC endpoint. So we are saying principal star action. So we are saying principal star and action S3 star. And effect is deny anything that doesn't come from the source VPC E that we have specified here. AWS source VPC string not equals AWS source VPC VPC 1A 2B 3C 4D. So or here is an example where we are denying any traffic that doesn't come from the source VPC. And source VPC, we have this is in case we have multiple VPC endpoints. So the second one is S3 bucket policy to restrict to an entire VPC, multiple VPC endpoints. So string not equals AWS source VPC. Okay, so moving on to next thing, we finally have now how can we troubleshoot a connection? How can we troubleshoot a connection from an instance in a private subnet in a VPC to Amazon S3? So, so the question is, how can we troubleshoot a connection from an instance in a private subnet in a VPC to Amazon S3? So, and as you can see, there's going to be a lot of moving parts, and but just before I do so, if you want to do it as an exercise yourself, try to see all the possible things that can go wrong when trying to connect to an instance, EC2 instance, in a private subnet onto an Amazon S3 bucket privately. Okay, so let's get started. First one is that we have to check the security group of our instance. The security group has outbound rules, and if the outbound rules are not allowing the traffic out, then things will certainly not work. And then we have to create our VPC endpoint gateway. Then things will VPC endpoint gateway, because we are accessing Amazon S3. And so our VPC endpoint gateway will have a VPC endpoint policy, and it needs to allow obviously our EC2 instance to access Amazon S3. Then we need to make sure that we update the route tables to make sure that anything that is requested for Amazon S3 is going to go through the VPC endpoint gateway. And if we don't set up the route table, then our EC2 instance can never talk to the VPC endpoint gateway, and things will not work in such a case. And also we need to make sure that the VPC DNS setting for the DNS resolutions are enabled for the resolution to be correctly done. Next one, we go through the VPC endpoint gateway. We are getting into the Amazon S3 bucket, and here we have to verify that the Amazon S3 bucket policy is indeed allowing our EC2 instance to access Amazon S3. And then finally, our EC2 instance may have an EC2 instance role, and that role may allow it or it may not allow it to access the S3 bucket. So we also have to check IAM permissions, and that's it. And as you can see, there's a lot of the moving parts that can restrict your EC2 instance from connecting to your Amazon S3 bucket, and understanding that is a key thing going into the exam. So that's it for this exam, this lecture. I will see you in the next one.